Herzlich willkommen bei einer neuen Ausgabe von Sterbeforschung.
Welcome to a new episode of Thanatology Up to Date. When people report on their near-death experiences, they often talk about light, love and comfort. However, there are also people who experience something completely different, who have so-called experiences of hell. Dr. Eberhard, are there really people who go to hell after they've died? Or how would you assess such experiences?
Well, there is a small number of near-death experiences that you could really describe as an experience of hell. But you can't really use that term for all negative near-death experiences, and you've also got to be very careful because the term hell is historically charged. So I'd rather use the word horrifying near-death experience. And these experiences are also gradual. One type of near-death experience that can be quite horrifying is when somebody fights against what he or she is experiencing, although the experience itself isn't horrible. For example, somebody who is sucked into a tunnel and they already know what will happen next. They either already had a near-death experience or they don't want to be in this situation. They don't want to die now, so they fight against it. Or they might already know this from reading literature about near-death experiences, and it's part of their general knowledge. So they recognize this tunnel and try to fight against it. So this was just one example, and then they're scared although this experience wouldn't have been negative in the first place. So this would be the lightest form of a horrifying near-death experience. And then there are also these experiences that are completely empty. For example, it pulls people who have a near-death experience into a sort of empty room. It is hard to imagine that it may be like in a dream. You're absolutely lost. We don't really have a proper word for this in German, but in English you would say void to describe a sort of emptiness. It might sound a bit trivial, but it can be very horrifying for the people that are affected by it. It's this feeling of being deserted, abandoned, or lost. And the worst form of these near-death experiences is definitely this sort of experience of hell, where demons appear, where it sinks, where they'd find an atmosphere of terror and fear. There, you'd have images of hell. They describe fire, demons. And this is why the word hell really fits here.
There are people who speak of experiencing light and love and others who speak of darkness and fear. This somehow reminds of the classic images of heaven and hell that are known from religious traditions. Could you imagine that these terms of heaven and hell could really have a realistic background?
Well, this is a good question that many people shy away from. Actually, people who tend to see the actual hereafter in a near-death experience. This problem was seen as a whole movement. When Raymond Moody published his first proto-scientific study in his book, Life After Death, he only mentioned positive near-death experiences which triggered a wave of euphoria that the hereafter is good. And then it came like a shadow when it became clear that sometimes there were also extremely horrifying near-death experiences. And this became influenced by different worldviews, so it became like a sort of hybrid. For example, Kenneth Ring, one of the renowned near-death experience researchers, accepted positive near-death experiences and thought that negative near-death experiences were triggered by medication. This might be a bit like cheating. I think either we accept negative near-death experiences as part of a reality of the hereafter, or we don't. And of course, we have various levels. The naturalistic or classic materialistic view doesn't care about these questions anyway. They just care about the question, how do near-death experiences develop? And where the near-death experiences present something real, they don't assume this possibility anyway. And from a psychological standpoint, these things are projections of the psyche. Then this would have a different meaning too. Then a negative near-death experience is a negative projection. And the last view is the spiritual transcendent interpretation. There we have the question whether the hereafter really exists. Whereby, here you also have to imagine that this thought isn't that absurd, that when humans really enter an afterlife, they can recreate something concrete with their thoughts. There are a few near-death experiences that point towards this. There aren't that few, and if that is the case, we actually have the power to create worlds, and then we also have the power to create very negative worlds. And maybe we might have the key in our hands why people may, and here I would also like to stress the may because it isn't so clear, why, for example, people who commit suicide, they are in a very depressed state of mind, why they are more likely to experience such worlds.
Are there certain life situations or certain people with a special affinity towards negative near-death experiences?
No, in this sense. It's quite difficult. But there are really no indications. If many people want that or wish for it, especially fundamentalists in monotheistic circles, but also in fundamentalistic Christian circles, they see negative near-death experiences as a confirmation of their worldviews. We even have to mention that the first publications of these experiences of hell were written by a medical doctor with a very fundamentalistic Christian attitude. He published a collection of these experiences in 1977, 2 years after Moody, or in parallel to him. And this was very controversial because they were the first negative near-death experiences people had heard of. And then they had the following interpretation. See, everybody who doesn't live according to Christ and the Gospels has deserved this. And the thing that beat everything was because it was that way. If, let's say, a criminal had a positive near-death experience or somebody who committed suicide, somebody who hadn't lived the correct way according to these fundamentalists, when somebody like that had a positive near-death experience, they interpreted it as a Luciferian pretense and things along those lines. So in my opinion, it's clear that things like that don't really count. You can't, and insofar, we know from studies that there is no correlation. We don't know with whom, when, and why these negative experiences occur. In theory, everybody would have the potential to have a negative near-death experience.
Life isn't black and white, and apparently this also applies to dying. Thank you very much, Dr. Eberhard, for these valuable incitations and thoughts. Thank you very much for this interview.